High-level Democrats and Republicans alike said today's meeting at the White House marked the beginning of the endgame in reaching a final deal on deficit reduction. The president and congressional leaders convened in the White House Cabinet Room amid talk of a grand bargain involving Social Security, Medicare, and tax reform. When it was over, Mr. Obama made an unscheduled appearance in the briefing room.
I thought it was a very constructive meeting. People were frank. We discussed the various options available to us. Everybody reconfirmed the importance of completing our work and raising the debt limit ceiling so that the full faith and credit of the United States of America is not impaired.
The president said talks between leaders and staffers would continue in the coming days, with negotiators meeting again Sunday at the White House. But he acknowledged that hard bargaining lies ahead.
Nothing is agreed to until everything's agreed to, and the parties are still far apart on a wide range of issues. And everybody acknowledged that there's going to be pain involved politically on all sides, but our biggest obligation is to make sure that we're doing the right thing by the American people.
The president offered little in the way of specifics, but it was widely reported that he's seeking up to $4 trillion in savings over 10 years instead of $2.4 trillion. The reductions would come from a combination of spending cuts, reforms in Medicare and Social Security, and upward of $1 trillion in new revenue from changes in the tax code. That squares with the Obama call last week that lawmakers do something big as part of a deal to increase the nation's borrowing authority. After meeting with House Republicans this morning, in advance of the White House session, House Speaker John Boehner confirmed that reforming the tax code was on the table.
We believe that comprehensive tax reform, both on the corporate side and personal side, would make America more competitive, help create jobs in our country, and it's something that is under discussion.
On the Senate side, Republican Mike Lee of Utah, a freshman elected with Tea Party backing, said the idea could draw his support.
I'd have to see what they're talking about. There's a difference between revenue raisers and tax increases. There are ways of raising revenue without raising taxes. If it's a tax increase, that's something that Republicans in the House and in the Senate are not going to support.
But Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid insisted that Republicans must back off their anti-tax hike stance if there's to be any chance of a deal.
Democrats believe all Americans, including those who can afford private jets and yachts, should contribute to the collective effort to reduce the deficit. The question is, why aren't Republicans willing to do the same?
Other Democrats voiced concern about giving ground on Social Security and Medicare. Arizona Congressman Raul Grijalva co-chairs the House Progressive Caucus.
If Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are on the table as part of the overall deal, and at least that's the discussion, that's what we've read, then we cannot support that deal. We understand it could be restructuring for Social Security and Medicare, but cuts to beneficiaries, cuts to benefits, raising retirement age, all of that is off the table.
Those positions will have to be reconciled if Congress is to craft the debt ceiling bargain that the president envisions before the August 2nd deadline. Otherwise, the government risks default on the nation's financial obligations. For more, we turn to Naftali Ben-David, congressional correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and Andy Kohut, president of the Pew Research Center. It's good to have you both with us. Naftali, let's start with you. They're talking about a big deal. So what could that entail?
Well, it probably entails a lot of political peril for both sides because it would entail adjustments to things like Social Security and Medicare, which Democrats are pretty much dead set against, and it would have to include some kind of tax increases to reach the kind of $4 trillion figure they're talking about. It would also involve a tremendous number of cuts to spending across the board, including the military. So I think what they're talking about essentially is holding hands and jumping off a cliff, something that would involve some pain for both sides.
So but Republicans clearly are still not there when it comes to tax increases. We heard Senator Mike Lee saying, well, it's one thing to talk about revenue raisers, but we're not going to talk about tax increases. How do you read what Republicans are thinking and are prepared to do on taxes?
Well, I think that they are prepared to increase taxes, but I think it has to be defined and described in a politically palatable way. So in other words, one person's tax increase is somebody else's, ending wasteful subsidies. But it amounts to the same thing in the sense that somebody's taxes are going to go up. And what Republicans have said is they're willing to accept the end of a lot of tax breaks as long as overall tax rates go down. And I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about here.
And this idea that it has to be revenue neutral, can revenue be raised? Is that something Republicans are prepared to vote for?
Well, I think in the end, they probably would be willing to accept an increase in revenue as long as some tax rates went down at the same time. But this is the sort of grand bargain that we're talking about, I mean, Democrats are going to have to accept things that they've said they never would accept, like changes to Social Security, and Republicans are going to have to accept some tax increases. Now, the question, and what Republicans and Democrats are trying to figure out in the next couple days, is can they pull that off?
The language, we described the language today as positive for a change. Do you see it that way? I mean, is there some feeling in the air that they are headed for some kind of an agreement?
I mean, I absolutely. I think there is. A couple days ago, I would have thought that maybe they're being so stubborn that actually they will run into a wall. But, at the meeting today, President Obama went around the table, and he asked everybody, do you want to go for a small deal, a medium deal, or a large deal? And by far the majority, people on both sides of the aisle said they wanted to go for the biggest possible deal, this $4.5 trillion deficit reduction agreement. And to me, that suggests that there's a certain amount of momentum behind some sort of deal.
Andy Kohut, you've been looking at what the American public thinks about the deficit, the debt. What do you find when you look at public opinion in terms of how they see the debt and what they think has caused the debt?
Well, the debt and deficit concern about it are an all-time high. Interestingly, we did a poll a few weeks ago which showed 60% saying the great contribution to this were the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Only 24% said increased domestic spending. And while there's a lot of focus on domestic spending, if you talk to the ordinary person, that spending is seen as vulnerable if it involves waste, fraud, and abuse. But when benefits or when the entitlements are considered, that's not considered waste, fraud, and abuse.
So when you ask them about the trade-offs they're prepared to accept in terms of how much cutting are you as a citizen prepared to see to deal with the debt, what do you find?
Well, surprisingly, when you ask about what's more important, preserving benefits for Social Security and Medicare by or reducing the deficit or the debt, 2 to 1, people say preserve our benefits. There's very little give there. Now, Republicans are more of the view that reducing the deficit should be given high priority. But even among Republicans, it's really interesting. There's a big income divide. Affluent Republicans say it's more important to reduce the deficit, but poorer Republicans, middle class and lower middle class Republicans say, no, protect our benefits.
And are these attitudes, Andy, that have changed over time with all the attention that's now being given to the size of the debt and the urgency of the problem?
Well, people are willing to do a lot of things to reduce this deficit. Concern is at an all-time high, but when it comes to entitlements, there's no movement. It really is rock solid when we see 2 to 1 margins.
And again, entitlements meaning Social Security,
Medicare, and even Medicaid. Having states make it more reduce eligibility for Medicaid, not 2 to 1, but a solid majority say no. Let's not do that.
Naftali, with all the public opinion in mind, what sort of divide, or is there one, between the leadership in the Democratic and Republican parties and the rank and file members?
I actually think that's one of the most interesting dynamics that we're seeing. President Obama and Speaker Boehner feel, I think, that it's in their interest to have a historic, grand, deal that could burnish their legacy. But the rank and file members, they have to run for re-election not too far from now. So any grand deal that includes benefit cuts to Social Security and Medicare, that includes tax increases, they're much more resistant to. So there's a couple things that have to happen here. Obama and Boehner have to agree on something, and then they also have to sell it to their members, and both of those things are equally important.
One of one of the overriding senses that one gets out of all this is that more of the debt reduction would come from cuts in entitlement than it would on the revenue side. Is that pretty much a given?
That is pretty much a given. I mean, I think there's something about the way the political landscape has evolved that people are willing to accept far more cuts, even Democrats, spending cuts rather than tax increases. I mean, tax increases have become such anathema, such poison in the political dialogue that I think people are talking about a 3-to-1 ratio or something approaching that.
And that's completely opposite to public opinion. When we say, if push comes to shove, if you have to do something, what would you rather see with respect to these entitlements? Revenues increased or taxes increased or benefits cut? People say raise taxes, raise costs, but don't cut those benefits.
And you see that across the board?
See that across the board.
Republican? What about Republican versus Democrat?
Well, there is a gap on this, but when you get such large 2-to-1 margins and you have this class division within the Republican Party that is potentially big stuff come election time, there will be a huge cry and howl if benefits are seen to have been cut here.
And so I hear you saying some of the public reaction is going to depend on how this is packaged, how it is described to the American people, whatever, if they come up with an agreement.
Right. I mean, there is support for raising the contribution cap and doing some things like that, but the notion that the retirement ages will be delayed or in some way people are going to have to pay a larger share of their Medicare costs out of their pocket. All of those things are very, very unpopular.
Finally, Naftali, what happens between now and Sunday?
Well, between now and Sunday, the staffers on both sides are going to get together and talk and try to come out with some rough ideas for the members of Congress and the president to talk about on Sunday. Sunday should really be kind of an incredible and very important meeting. They're going to start in the afternoon. It's widely expected they'll go for hours and hours into Sunday evening, and I think we'll find out at that meeting whether a grand deal is really possible.
Well, we know what you're going to be doing this weekend.
That's right.
It won't be relaxing. Naftali Ben-David, Andy Kohut, we thank you both.
Welcome.
Thanks very much.